Welcome to another midweek lesson from Grace Christian Assembly. Open your Bible and join us as we dig into the Word. Now, here's our teacher, Jim McClarty.
Okay, Exodus 3, that's where we're at. We're in Exodus 3, and when we ended last week, Moses was speaking with God at the burning bush. And one of the things I tried to emphasize last week is that we're going to get a very consistent personality profile of Moses as we continue through this book. The same way that in the New Testament, the most consistent personality profile that you get is Peter. And I don't think that's by mistake. For instance, you know the Gospel of Mark. You know that Mark was not one of the original apostles. John Mark, young man. Right, the youngest. So it is commonly known from the early church fathers that Mark wrote under the tutelage of Peter. And so in many ways, the Gospel of Mark is the Gospel of Peter. He had the great influence on Mark to write the things that he wrote. And it is also the shortest of the four Gospels. And yet you find more about Peter's failure in the book of Mark than you do the other three Gospels, even though it's the shortest one, because Peter was very upfront about his constant foot and mouth problems and how often he was saying and doing the wrong thing and running contrary to Christ, because that gave him the basis, the groundwork from which he could say, this is all about God's grace. This is all about Christ's sacrifice. It's not anything about ourselves. Self-deprecating, yes, to the maximum. Now, you see a very consistent thing going on here in the book of Exodus. Since we know that it's written by Moses, it's interesting that as we continue through this conversation, Moses did not take the time to cover up his multiple missteps here. And he's going to say a lot of things that just have written all over them. If you can read the subtext, if you can learn to read the white spaces between the black lines, there are several places here where you can very comfortably insert, don't, that... Because he's going to say things till we get to chapter 4, and it's just going to say, and then God just got mad at him. And in fact, later on, God is going to meet him at an inn, and it is God's intention to kill him, which is very interesting for Moses to write that. So we'll get to that too. The very consistent personality we see of Moses is that he's hard-headed, difficult, argumentative. He's very upset about his inability to speak well. He's not a good orator. Concerned about his own reputation. He's going to say a couple times tonight, what if they don't believe me? God says, go do this. Go tell my people. Go tell Pharaoh. Go bring the people out here to worship me. And he says, what if they won't come? What if they don't believe me? He's afraid that his own reputation is going to be sullied in some way. And so God then is going to show him some miracles he can do. And say, here, I'll give you a couple of signs you can use when you get there, and the Israelites will believe you when they see these signs. And sure enough, he goes and shows those signs to the Israelites, and they do believe. And then he goes into the court of Pharaoh, and he does the exact same signs, and all it does is make Pharaoh more angry and hard-hearted. And his magicians mimic the signs. So one more time, you're going to see a revelation of God, miraculous signs, that among those people that God wants it to convince, they're going to be convinced. And to those people who God is intending to punish, those people are not going to believe, even though they see the signs. I'm going to see a lot of consistent theology developing here, and then a lot of foreshadowing of New Testament concepts, particularly about Christ. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this conversation, and all I'm hoping to do tonight is get to the end of this conversation at the burning bush, pulling in a lot of extra side material to expand it and understand it. Okay, so let's start then in chapter 3, right at the top. Chapter 3, verse 1. That'll get us up to speed when we hit the new material. Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said also, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. And now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" So right away Moses begins contending with God. "I'm not up to this job. Who am I that I should do this?" And he said, "Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain." Then Moses said to God, continuing to argue, "Behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I shall say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' Now they may say to me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" And God said to Moses, "I am that I am." Some of your translations will say, "I am who I am." "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" That then becomes a proper name of God, God revealing a name by which he can be known. And God furthermore said to Moses, this is new material now, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. I am. I am that I am." This is a name God gives himself. Now in that verse 15, most of your translations, when he says, "I am the Lord, the God of your fathers," Lord will be in all capital letters, yes? When you see that, that's usually a translation of what's called the tetragrammaton. Use it in a sentence later. It's in English letters, YHWH, Yahweh. This is the word that the early translators and the Jews would not pronounce. They had so much respect for this that when the copyists were copying any piece of Old Testament scripture, they would take out a quill that had never been used, dip it in ink, write that name once, and destroy that quill because it had written the name of God. This is the name that was not allowed to be spoken. It was considered blasphemy if you spoke the name of God. Now there is another word, Adonai. Are you familiar with that word? Oftentimes translated God in the Old Testament. And in order to make this name, Yahweh, pronounceable, they took the vowel sounds from Adonai, added it to Yahweh, and came up with Yehovah, which we know as Jehovah, as the sounds of the letters have migrated into the more Celtic languages and into the Germanic languages. The Y and the V change sound the same way that, like in Russia, vodka is pronounced vodka, yeah. And so the V and W sounds move around a little bit, and the same way that we would pronounce J-O-S-E in the Spanish language is pronounced Jose, because the J and the H sounds move. And so Yahweh made its way into Yahuwah, Jehovah. So when you see the capital L-O-R-D, Jehovah is the name that's actually being translated there, or Yahweh, the tetragrammaton. That is a revelatory name of God. The name Jehovah is one of those names that God gave himself in order to reveal something about himself. And so oftentimes there are suffixes to that name, like Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Shalom, the God of our peace. The reason that's important is that when Jesus came on the scene of history, Mary was told, "You shall call his name Yeshua." The English cognate of that is Joshua. So in the Old Testament, we read that it is Joshua, or Yeshua, who led the children of Israel finally into the promised land. So then, interestingly, when the Son of God came onto the planet, it was specifically said by God that his name was going to be Yeshua, because it means God, Jehovah, who saves, Jehovah Ashua. And so the God that is with us and saves is the name that Jesus was given. So this Jehovah name is very important, and it travels throughout the Old Testament as God continues to give it new indications and new revelations of who he is and what he's like. Then he adds, since he has the right to identify himself any way he wants, he has added now the name I am, the God that exists. And then he adds to it and says, "This is my name forever, and this shall be my memorial name to all generations," so that they would know the Lord, Yahweh, as I am, the God that is, in contrast to, as I said last week, the pantheon of Egyptian gods that aren't. But this is the God who is. Now, the reason that's really interesting is because once God identifies himself by that name and says, "This is now a proper name of mine, a memorial name of mine. I am that I am. I am the God that is. I am." That's a name only he can claim, because he's the only God that is. So nobody else has a right to lay claim to that name. Well, then Jesus walks onto the stage of history, and you can turn over to John 18. Flip over there, and I'll meet you there in a minute. Keep your finger in Exodus, and we'll get back to that. John 18 is where we're headed. One of the most interesting aspects of Christianity is that it is the only respected world religion where the founder claimed to be deity. When you look at Islam, which is growing like mad around the world right now, a central tenet of Islam is there is one God, his name is Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Muhammad never claimed to be deity. Buddha never claimed to be deity. There are people in the history of the world who have claimed to be God, but then we do our best to catch them and put them in a padded room and look at them through a little hole in the door, because we know that anybody who claims to be God is crazy. And yet, Christianity has become one of the leading world religions built on the foundation of a leader, a founder, who claimed to be God. And people followed him. And he accepted worship as a God. And he went about proving that he was God by the miracles that he did. And one of the proofs that he offered that he was God is that he took to himself that name that God just told Moses belongs only to God. God said, "That is my name, that is my memorial name through all generations." And we're going to read in John 18 here where Jesus takes that name to himself. And when he does, look at what it does to people. Let's start at John 18, verse 1, right at the top. This is in the Garden of Gethsemane after Jesus has prayed both the high priestly prayer and then gone and prayed, "Father, if it were possible, take this cup from me." And when Jesus had spoken these words, he went forth with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron, where there was a garden into which he himself entered and his disciples. Now Judas also, who was betraying him, knew the place, for Jesus had often met there with his disciples. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and from the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, "Who do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus the Nazarene." And he said to them, now many of your translations will say, "I am he." The word "he" is not in there. What he said is, "I am." And there's every indication that when he said it, he was using the proper name of God. They said, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He refused to allow them the limited concept that he was just a carpenter's son from Nazareth. So he took to himself the proper name that only God can use. And when God incarnate used the word I am, it says in verse 6, they drew back and they all fell to the ground. Because you can't stand in front of the real God when he declares his own name. So here again you have proof that Jesus' conception of himself is that he was God. He went about saying it, he went about proving it, he went about declaring it. When they said, show us the Father and it'll suffice us. He said, have I been so long with you and you still don't know me? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He equated himself with God. He considered himself to be God. And there have been several books through the years that have been written based on that concept, that once you look at Jesus closely and the things he said about himself, this was one of the things that drove C.S. Lewis to say that when you consider Christ, you either have to admit that he is who he said he is. You either have to admit that he's God incarnate, or you have to liken him to a man who thinks he's a poached egg. Those are your choices. He's either crazy nuts or he's God, because he walked around saying things like this about himself. Except that he continued to demonstrate this power that only God could have. But his self-conception was that he was God and was willing to take a name that God told Moses belonged only to God. And importantly, Jesus did not just identify himself as a God or any God, but as the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, that same God who made the worlds, that same God who gave the land to Israel, that same God that brought Israel out of Egypt. Jesus tied himself to all of that and said, I'm that God. Which is why John would begin his gospel with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John's whole gospel is about proving that Jesus is, in fact, God incarnate. And I don't think you need a better proof of it than John writing here, and I think it's why John included this little story. He's the only one that includes it of the four Gospels, that when Jesus said the proper name of God, it knocked everybody down. They didn't just stand there in front of him saying, really, that's you? The power of God speaking his own name knocked them down. So, okay, back to Exodus. So the point here is, once God has introduced the name I am, in verse 15 he said, this is my name forever. This is my memorial name for all generations. Then only God can use that name. And when Jesus used it, it was proof positive yet again that the Christ we worship and follow is God incarnate. Got that? So then, verse 16, God says to Moses, go gather the elders of Israel together. Say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, has appeared to me saying, I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. That's really interesting, and I think, by the way, it's going to be a little bit of a hard sell. 400 years they've been in bondage. If they know anything about how they ended up in bondage, they're in bondage because Abraham said, how will I know that this is my land? And God said, I'm going to put them in a land where they're not known. And then I'm going to make them a nation down there, and they're going to serve them for 400 years, and then I'll bring them out. 400 years of bondage. I can't think of a better example than July 4th, 1776. So that makes America a little older than 200, about 225 years old. Right in that, 2.25 somewhere. So think back to like the 1600s. King James translation time, 1611, early 1600s. What were people wearing? What were they doing? How did they think? How did they speak? What was going on here in America during those years? Yeah, we had pilgrims going on. Yeah.
Well, think about how God-centered we were as a country starting off and how debased we are now.
Absolutely.
After 220 years.
Look what those years have done to us. Sure. over the course of 400 years, how far would these people have wandered from their heritage? Living in Egypt, of course you can see why once they start wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, they start saying things like, I wish we were back in Egypt.
Well, they didn't even have synagogues or anything in Egypt.
Exactly right. And in fact, as we're going to discover, they had stopped circumcising. There was no point. I mean, they had lost all sense of who they were and what their heritage was, which is why I'm saying it's going to be a hard sell when Moses goes in and says, now I've been with the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've been with Jehovah, and he wants you to know he's concerned about your state here in Egypt. And they've got to look around and go, really? We've had 400 years of backbreaking bondage here. But the only reason they had to endure that 400 years is because that is exactly what God had determined for them in order to prove his absolute sovereignty over them.
He's building up a population that would cover the ground.
Right, and building up that population. I am indeed concerned about you and what has been done to you in Egypt. So I said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt, to the land of the Canaanite and of the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite, to a land flowing with milk and honey. 400 years they've been living in Egypt. They have no idea where this is. These are not people who had maps. These are not people who have traveled. These are slaves. They have no idea where this land is. They can't conceive of a land that wonderful. And here's God saying, I'm going to bring you out. And look at verse 18. Here is a dramatic statement. And they will pay heed to what you say. Is that an interesting thing for God to say? What about their free will? What if they opt not to believe? Contrast that with chapter 4, verse 21. Look at the contrast. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders that I've put into your power, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. That means that whole Passover thing, the death angel, the killing of the firstborn, God had all that in mind before he ever sent Moses into Egypt. God knew that Pharaoh was not going to believe him, and did he just know it or did he decree it? He put down here, he decreed it. He said, this is what is going to happen. Then he's going to continue on later and say, he's not going to believe you because I'm going to harden his heart. Now, contrast that, like I said a moment ago, contrast that with gather all the elders of Israel together, tell them what I've said, and verse 18, and they will pay heed to what you say. And you, with the elders of Israel, will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go, except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he'll let you go. So God has said, you're going to go and you're going to do the same signs and you're going to preach the same message to two different groups of people. And when you preach it to my people, the Israelites, even though they've been under bondage for 400 years, when you preach what I've told you to preach to my people, they're going to hear it and they're going to respond. And when you preach what I've told you to preach to the Egyptians, they're not going to listen to you. And I'm going to punish them for not listening to you. And I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that he won't listen to you, so that when he withholds Israel, my firstborn, I can kill all his firstborn. God said he was going to do all that before Moses ever walked into Egypt. Now you can read Arminian commentary after Arminian commentary. And they will struggle with this fact, and they will say, well, what it is the same way that God knows who's going to believe him. He knows who's going to choose, and that's why he chooses them. God elects people who he knows are going to have faith and believe him. That's the same kind of foreknowledge they claim God had here. They'll say, well, God knew that the Israelites were going to believe and listen. The same way that God knew that Pharaoh wasn't going to listen. He knew what Pharaoh was like. He knew that Pharaoh was hard-hearted. So he knew that Pharaoh was going to harden his own heart. And therefore, God could say these things. Except that if you just read the text, God is saying, they will listen and I will harden his heart. And not just I will harden his heart. Look at what everything God says he's going to do in reaction. I'm going to do miracles. I'm going to do signs. He's still not going to let you go until I kill all his firstborn. God knew everything he was going to do. And then, of course, he ends up drowning the army of Pharaoh in the Red Sea. Now, this is a really interesting demonstration of how sovereignty works. I've told you many times in passing reference, so I hope that I can, instead of reading it tonight, just kind of synopsize tonight. But one of the most fascinating passages of the book of Isaiah is where God declares that he is going to use the Assyrian army as his own battle axe. And he's going to use the Assyrians to punish Israel for Israel's rebellion against God. And so God is going to send Assyria down on Israel to punish Israel for not keeping his commands and following his Sabbaths. And then God says, after I've used Assyria to punish my people, and then they take my people into bondage, after my people have served the bondage that is my punishment on my people, I'm then going to punish the Assyrians because they're going to be very haughty in the way that they come attack my people. And so I am going to punish the Assyrians for the haughtiness with which they come and attack my people, which I'm going to do in order to punish my people. So God uses the Assyrians to punish the Israelites, and then punishes the Assyrians
Because he didn't like the way they punished them.
because he didn't like the way he didn't like the fact that they punished his people. But God said, I'm going to use them to punish my people. And then I'm going to punish them for punishing my people. How dare you come up against my people, you and your haughty hearts. Well, this is very much what's happening here. God told Abraham 400 years they're going to serve in Egypt. And then God could have just miraculously brought them back out. It could have been a very peaceful exchange. It was with Cyrus. Cyrus the Persian releases the Israelites to go back and rebuild the temple. Just start signing decrees and away they go. It could have been that easy. No, God instead said, after 400 years of bondage against my people, I'm going to bring them out, and I'm going to bring them out with a mighty hand in such a way that my people are going to see the way I did it, and they're going to realize that I'm on their side. And in order to demonstrate how on their side I am, I'm going to punish their captors. And so God is going to bring them out with a mighty hand and punish the Egyptians for the 400 years of keeping God's people in bondage. Which he ordained in the first place and told Abraham he was going to do. The same way he told Isaiah he was going to do it with the Assyrians. The same way he told Isaiah 150 years in advance what he was going to do with Cyrus, the king of Persia.
The scripture that describes what you're saying is he forms the spirit of man within him. He
Yes.
formed Pharaoh's heart, and he forms Cyrus's heart.
Yes, he did. And the heart of the king is in God's hands, and like the rivers of water, he turns it whithersoever he pleases. Yeah, I mean, that's the God, the sovereign God of the Bible. It's amusing and sad to read the number of commentaries that struggle with God declaring that he is absolutely... What are you pointing at? Oh, you have a commentary that tries to argue it.
And in the end, he says, this hardening of men's heart is one way God judges men who resist his will.
Right. You start by resisting his will, and then God turns you over.
Yes. And
right.
it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart.
Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Yeah.
I have heard that preached so many times.
Mm-hmm.
Don't resist God. Don't resist God. Your heart will be hardened. You know, one opportunity. This is all you get. You know.
Oh, you get that one opportunity. If you pass that up, God will harden your heart. Big old loving God will harden your heart if you miss this opportunity. Yeah. I mean, even a bus company knows to send another bus later. But God, he'll give you that one shot and then harden your heart. Sorry. Which makes men much more gracious than God. They'll at least send you another bus. Anyway. I just equated God's mercy and a bus line. No idea how that happened. Now, by the way, notice that nowhere in the text can you draw from what the text says what Libby just read and what Carol was just talking about. This notion of Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then God turned him over to that wicked heart, and then God hardened Pharaoh's heart in response to the fact that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. You can't see that anywhere in the text, but that's what happens when you start with a tradition of free will, and then you force that tradition onto the text, and then you have to deal with these texts that declare God's absolute sovereignty to do what he wants with anybody he wants, and that rubs up against you so badly that you go, I can't stand a God like that, so I'll just say that there's stuff in the text that isn't there.
Well, there's no indication here either that God had intention to save Pharaoh.
No, there's no intention to save Pharaoh. Don't you think if God's intention was to save Pharaoh, he would have saved Pharaoh? Yeah. Is there anywhere in the Bible where God ever wants anybody he doesn't get? No. God gets whoever he wants because he's God, does whatever he wants. Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. And so if he had wanted to save Pharaoh, he would have saved Pharaoh. There's no intention to save Pharaoh. Yeah, there's no desire to save Pharaoh. Instead, there's only the desire to use Pharaoh as a demonstration of the power of God so that God's people will recognize the power of God that saved them. But isn't that exactly what Paul writes over in Romans 9? Let's go read it. Let's go over there for a minute. Let's see how Paul deals with this. And let's see if Paul says, well, Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Instead, Paul's going to say, for this reason have I raised you up. Starting in Romans 9, let's say verse 14. This is right on the heels of Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. God picking and choosing. What shall we say then? There is no injustice with God, is there? May it never be. The King James says, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? Yeah, this claim that somehow God would be unfair in his dealings with men. Paul's answer is, may it never be. For he said to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. James White does a very good job of exegeting that particular passage, and he points out that in the Greek, there's a change in the tenses of the words in the English in order to follow the rules of English. But in the Greek, it actually reads, I will mercy. It's an active verb. It's not I will have mercy. I will mercy whomever I will mercy. I will compassion whomever I will compassion. It's an activity of God. And God actively does that mercying and that compassioning on whoever he wants to. So he said to Moses, I will mercy whom I will mercy. I will compassion who I will compassion. So then it does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs. It depends on God who has mercy. That couldn't be more clear, could it? So then it's not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. That's just as plain as it can be. He's just given a demonstration of Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And he said to Moses, I'll have mercy on whoever I will. I'll have compassion on whoever I will. For the scripture says to Pharaoh. Okay, good. Now we're getting to Paul's interpretation of the whole Pharaoh heart hardening event. What is Paul's take on the theology we should draw from that? For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very reason I have raised you up, to demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed throughout the whole earth. So what did God do to Pharaoh? Brought plagues, destroyed their economy, destroyed their crops, and then killed all the firstborn, and then drowned his army. And God said, I did all that for my sake. I did all that so that my name would be proclaimed throughout the earth. I did all that to you to demonstrate my power in you. So the same way that God could have demonstrated his power, as Carol just said, God could have demonstrated his power by saving Pharaoh. Pharaoh was no worse or any harder to get than any other man on earth. God could certainly have saved him. When you have somebody like Paul writing that he was the chiefest of sinners and yet God got him, certainly God could have gotten Pharaoh. And that would have been a great demonstration of God's power. But instead, God demonstrated his own power in Pharaoh by destroying Pharaoh. And it was still a demonstration of God's power so that God's name would be proclaimed in all the earth. That's the theology Paul thinks we ought to draw from it. Not that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and then God turned him over and God had no choice but to harden Pharaoh's heart because Pharaoh had already started down that road. No, instead, here's what Paul says. So then, remember a minute ago, I'll mercy who I'll mercy, I'll compassion who I'll compassion. So then, Paul wraps up verse 18, so then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. So what Paul draws from the Pharaoh example and the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is that God actively hardens the same way he actively mercies. That's the parallel. You can't escape the parallel. So then he mercies who he will, and he hardens who he will. And it's not of him that wills, and it's not of him that runs. It's of God that shows mercy. So then he has mercy on whom he desires, and he hardens whom he desires. And you'll say to me then, why does he then still find fault for who resists his will? It's a great question. The question is, well,
is it not fair?
It's not fair. That's the basic argument. How can God judge people who only did what God ordained they would do? How do you judge Pharaoh for not believing when you've hardened his heart so that he wouldn't believe? How do you judge Assyria for attacking Israel when you used Assyria to attack Israel? How do you judge Egypt for taking your people into bondage when you told Abraham you were going to use Egypt and take your people into bondage? The question is, that's not fair. If everybody only did what God ordained they would do, how in the world can he judge anybody? The reason that question is so vitally important is just as we saw demonstrated by that bit of bad theology that Libby read a few moments ago. People will do their absolute best to create fairness in the whole structure. Like Larry just said, that's not fair. And so they will say, well, then let's make it fair. We'll say that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and then God reacted by hardening Pharaoh's heart. That's fair. That's more fair. We would all say, well, fair enough then. And then God saved some people because he looked down the long telescope of time and he saw who was going to believe. And once he knew they were going to believe, he elected them to eternal life because he knew they were going to believe, and everybody had a fair chance to believe, but the ones who chose to believe, those are the ones that get heaven. That's fair. But if you create that kind of intrinsic fairness, you've destroyed Paul's whole argument, and you will never arrive at the question he thinks you're going to arrive at. All the way through chapters 7, 8, 9, he's been building this argument that God is absolutely sovereign, saves whoever he wants, hardens whoever he wants, which will lead you to the question, how is that fair? If you don't arrive at that question, you haven't understood Paul's whole argument. Paul's whole argument is designed to lead you to the question, how is that fair? So if you back up and try to make it fair, and say, well, it's fair because of this, and it's fair because of that, and it's fair because of that, you've undermined his whole argument because you'll never arrive at the question about fairness. Paul understands that the theology he is laying out is intrinsically not fair. That's the point.
The fairness of it, that the Egyptians were an atheistic pagan country.
So was Abraham. Abraham was an idol worshiper, and his dad was an idol maker.
These people were the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were people that God was raising.
I'm just being argumentative with you. Because my point is this. All human beings are in fact sinful, depraved, going to chase foreign gods, chase after their own flesh, and left to ourselves, we will all be like that, as Abraham was. So you're right that God is right to judge them. God is right to judge everybody. God is right to send everybody to hell. Ever since the fall, God is right to judge everybody.
And he had a right to raise these people up if he wanted.
And that's the point. He also has the right, as God, to be gracious to some sinners who don't deserve it. People are so upside down and backwards in their thinking about God that they think all human beings are intrinsically good, and therefore it's unfair of God not to give everybody a fair shot, and then some people end up in hell. The biblical paradigm is all people are wretched, like you just described. All people are depraved, all people are sinful, and all people deserve judgment. Therefore, God is gracious to some people and brings them to himself, but when he punishes people, that's completely fair. It's what they deserved to begin with.
At least he didn't destroy the whole earth.
Exactly.
Well, he did once with the flood. He's going to do it again with the fire at the end of time. And he's yes, and he's completely right to do it. But this is why theology matters so much. If you don't have a proper theology, then you do conceive of a God who is unfair, unkind, malicious, mean, because he sends really good people to hell. Not only are they really good people to start with, but then he sent his son to pay for the sins of the whole world. So they're really good people who have no sins to pay for, and then they end up going to hell. How are you going to explain that? We end up having to explain it on the basis of something like, well, they didn't choose Jesus, and so they... But the reality is, the Bible says all men are wicked and depraved and hell-bound, and that's what they deserve. So God's judgment is waiting on all of humanity. If between here and judgment, he plucks some brands out of the furnace, he takes some people who don't deserve it and is kind to them and gracious to them, that is within God's province to do, but he's not required to do it for everybody. And he's perfectly right and just to judge his enemies who remain his enemies by virtue of the fact that he didn't change them. And that's Paul's whole argument, it's Paul's whole theology. If you don't understand human depravity, you can't get any of the rest of your theology right. If you start with people who are pretty good, then God is unfair. So notice how Paul answers, since we've come this far. He says, you'll say to me, why does he find fault? Who resisted his will? On the contrary, who are you? That's a great way to make that argument. As long as you're standing up there on your hind legs arguing against God. The next question is, and who are you? Who are you to argue against God? That's his point. On the contrary, who are you, O man, who answers back to God? The thing that is molded will not say to the one who's molding, why did you make me like this? So he goes right for Jeremiah's example of the potter and the clay. The clay pot doesn't say to the potter, I don't feel like being an ashtray. I prefer to be a beautiful vase that people will sit in the corner and admire. I don't want to be a waste paper basket. I prefer to be something nicer. No, instead the potter has the right to make whatever he wants, his clay. So he makes that argument in verse 21. Does the potter have a right over the clay to make from the very same lump one vessel for honor and another for common use? Doesn't the potter have the right, out of his lump of clay, to put something on the wheel and make a beautiful vase and put it up on a shelf, and everybody who comes in admires it and says, look at that thing I made, that's beautiful, isn't it? And then he can also make ashtrays and cups and bowls that when they break or crack, you just throw them away. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say something. I've had this discussion with a lot of people too, and if you'll notice in all these commentaries and everything, people's mind, what they're envisioning is that Pharaoh is neutral and that God is taking and making a good Pharaoh bad.
Right.
You hit it right on the head. They think people are good
Yeah.
or neutral.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Either way, it's not the biblical view of man. He's totally dead and
Right.
depraved. So you can see it when you're arguing with people or talking with people that they immediately flip-flop and think that they're actually arguing against hyper-Calvinism is what they're arguing against. We're not saying that God is making a good Pharaoh bad or a neutral Pharaoh bad. Pharaoh's bad to begin with, and
Bad
he's
to start with.
using his badness.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay, we got to move or we're not going to make it here. Does not the potter have the right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for common use? What if God, although perfectly willing to demonstrate his wrath, that's what you need to know about God. When you envision God and you start thinking God is love, 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 God the big marshmallow, you have to recognize that God is perfectly willing to show his wrath. We've known that ever since that little thing known as the flood. Right? God is perfectly willing. We've read all about the day of the Lord, going to destroy the whole earth with fire. We know wrath is coming. And then there's that whole concept of hell. Not just hell, lake of fire. Worm never sleep, fire never quenched, outer darkness, gnashing of teeth. God is perfectly willing to show his wrath. Everything we know about God, he continues demonstrating that he's perfectly willing to show his wrath. And he should. What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, isn't that what he just said about Pharaoh? I did this to you to make my power known, that my name will be declared throughout all the earth. And he can do that by saving, but he can do it by demonstrating wrath. Nevertheless, he endured with much patience the vessels of wrath that are prepared for destruction. This is language that we've kind of lost the sense of, but this is within that analogy of pottery. One of the ways that archaeologists have been able to trace the path, the 40-year path that the Israelites took through the Sinai desert and through the wilderness, is that they've been able to follow the pottery trail. Because everywhere they went, they would light fires, they would make pottery. And of course, if it broke, you would just leave it, you'd throw it away. So at any time you have an encampment of 1 million or more people making clay pottery, they're going to leave behind, wherever they camped and as they travel, they're going to leave behind broken bits of pottery. And so those things were made with the intention that you would just use them until they were broke, and then you just leave them behind. Those were vessels made for destruction. They were made to be broken and left behind. And Paul just equated human beings with vessels that were prepared for destruction. And he says, doesn't God have that right? From one lump of clay, the earth, Adam was made out of the dust of the ground. And we all know ashes to ashes, dust to dust. We go back into the ground. We're buried in the ground. Come back and dig us up in a few years. We're not there anymore. We went back to the dust. So we're just clay pots. And God has the right out of the same lump of clay of the earth to make some vessels for honorable use. And the honorable use is that he can display us for the rest of eternity saying, these are my trophies of grace. Look at what I did. I saved these wretches. Honorable use. But at the same time, he has the absolute right, since it's his clay, to make vessels that are fitted for destruction. That's their purpose. That's their reasoning. And that's their reason for existing. And that's why he also said, I raised Pharaoh up for this very reason. That's, by the way, again, Paul's theology drawn from the whole Pharaoh heart-hardening thing. What if God, willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? And he did so in order for this. Remember that he destroyed the Egyptians to demonstrate his power for his people, so that his people would come to know and worship him. For that reason, he destroyed Pharaoh. So, Paul draws from that. He did it so that he might make known the riches of his glory upon the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. So God has made people who he intends to use to demonstrate his glory and his grace, vessels of honor. But along the way, in order to demonstrate how great his glory and grace is to those vessels of honor, he also made vessels fitted for destruction, so that we, the vessels that were fitted for his glory, are going to be able to witness, to see, to understand the demonstration of his power in the destruction of the vessels that were created for that very reason. Now, this is a hard concept to get a hold of, that God has made some people so that he can demonstrate to his people how good he was to his people in how bad he was to those other people. Right? So that we will fall down on our face in front of him and say, this is to the glory of your grace. Because all those people over there, gnashing of teeth, outer darkness, burning, smoke of their torment, rise up forever and ever, we're the same type, we're the same lump, we're the same clay. There's nothing about me that's better than them. They got that, I got this. How do I describe that? How do I explain that? It can only be to the glory of his grace. I keep saying that everything God does, He does for His glory. And He is going to save some wretched sinners for His glory. But He is equally going to destroy the vessels that were fitted for destruction for His glory. And part of that glory is that we, the vessels of honor, are going to see and recognize the power that He imposed on the vessels of wrath in order that we can see this demonstration of His magnificence so that we worship Him forever, knowing that we're in His presence, not because we deserve it, but because He is how He is. He did so in order that He might make known the riches of His glory upon the vessels of mercy, which He prepared beforehand for glory, even us. I like the even us part. Even us whom He also called, not from among the Jews only, but also from among the Gentiles. And so when we think about what is the theology to be drawn from the whole Pharaoh hardening episode, the only proper theology to draw is the theology Paul just drew, which is God does all this as a demonstration of His glory, and the salvation of His people, Jew and Gentile, wrapped up in Christ, is a demonstration of His grace, because we know full well that He's capable of hardening and perfectly willing to demonstrate His wrath. And if He doesn't, it's because of grace, 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 grace. Right? Okay, so where did that leave us in Exodus? I didn't know if we'd even get through the whole conversation tonight. Verse 18 said, "They will pay heed to what you say, and you with the elders of Israel will come to the king of Egypt, and you will say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. So now please let us go out 3 days' journey into the wilderness, so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not permit you to go, except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and smite and strike Egypt with all my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that he will let you go. And I will grant this people,'" the Israelites, "I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be that you will go. When you go, you will not go empty-handed, but every woman shall ask of her neighbor. And the woman who lives in her house, they'll ask for articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and your daughters, and thus you'll plunder the Egyptians." So God adds to it, not only am I going to bring you out, I'm going to bring you out with all the wealth and gold that you can possibly plunder from your Egyptian neighbors. You're not going to come out a straggling bunch of slaves. In fact, when they go out, you're going to see that there's not a halt or a lame or a blind one among them. God's going to heal them all. I'm sorry?
You'll have your IRS.
Oh, yes. You'll be ready for your retirement account. But let me just add this little addendum. When God finally gets them out there to the foot of Mount Sinai, the first thing He's going to do is start constructing the tabernacle in the wilderness. And He's going to say, and oh yeah, I want it furnished with gold. And I want it to be made really, really well. And so He says, Moses, take up an offering. And you can't take up an offering from a bunch of impoverished slaves. They got nothing to give you. So even though it appears that what God just did here, He said, you're going to plunder the Egyptians and you're going to come out with all the gold and all the silver. Notice He mentions that. And then when He gets into the wilderness, He's going to say, okay, now remember the gold and silver I gave you? I'm expecting an offering for my worship, to build my tabernacle, to build the place where I'm going to meet with you. I want beautiful clothes for my priests, and I want gold on all my furnishings coming from you, because I just gave you all that stuff. So, of course, there we can even get into the theology of giving, that it is God who provides for you the stuff that He comes and asks from you, and that, of course, you would give Him back what He's already provided for you. It was all His to begin with. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, and I didn't want to miss that in passing, that He says, on your way out, ask from your neighbors, and I'm going to give favor in their eyes.
It took the ladies to do that.
It took what?
The ladies are to do that.
Yeah, I noticed that. Send the women, tell them to go to their neighbors and get all the gold and silver and get everything they can get. And they're going to walk out with all that abundance, and once they get where God's taken them, He's going to say, okay, it's time for an offering. And it's the only place in the Bible where you're going to find that when Moses is taking up the offering, he finally says, all right, now go tell the people that's enough. we're good now. We've got too much. Because God so over-provided for them that they were able to give back so much into the service of God that he goes back and says, that's good, we're done. So we'll see that. That's coming up in Exodus too. There's all sorts of great stuff coming up in Exodus. What we want to leave with tonight, one more time, is God is sovereign. How clear was that tonight? God mercies who he'll mercy. He'll have compassion on whom he'll have compassion, and whom he will he hardens. And so if you're not in the hardened camp, hit your knees. Yep. Say thank you, because he's perfectly willing to demonstrate his wrath. He's also perfectly willing to demonstrate his grace. And if you're a vessel of that mercy and that grace, boy, you sure didn't deserve it. But your concept of God has to be big enough to embrace him the way he's actually revealed in Scripture. And the way he's revealed in Scripture is a God who does everything for his own glory. And that includes saving people, and that includes judging people. It's all about him. It's not about you. And if you start your theology with you, you're going to wind up with a wacky version of him. You've got to start your theology with him, and then that will bring your concept of you into a right relationship.
Thank you for joining us for this week's lesson. If you would like more information about Grace Christian Assembly or the teaching of God's sovereign grace, please visit us on the World Wide Web at salvationbygrace.org.